So today's sector chat has two incredible speakers, both giving us the opportunity for a Q&A, which will be great too. So if you've got questions, we're going to be able to have a questions and answers section. Before I introduce them, I'd like to give everyone a brief domestic violence New South Wales update. And I know in our sector chats, that's been something that the members really value. So I'll try and keep it fairly brief as Dealey Donovan can these days, because there's always so much to say, but a few key updates. So as I'm sure everybody knows, there's an election on Saturday. Yesterday, the New South Wales Women's Alliance released its scorecard, which Lisa's going to pop in the chat box now. So this scorecard compared 6 political party responses to the 7 calls to action that the New South Wales Women's Alliance defined, those 7 calls to action. We've been asking for that whole of government approach, as you all know. And under those 7 calls to action, of course, there were 60 policy recommendations, and we asked for those political parties to respond. What were they going to do? Should they get in power or should they stay in power? So you'll see the scorecard in the chat box, and you'll see that there's a key around who fully supported, who partially supported, and then those that provided some interesting insights. You'll see One Nation, I think, provided one response, which was everyone should go to prison. But anyway, you'll see those full responses on that website. The New South Wales Women's Alliance assessed each party response to the same list of questions, including election policies and announcements shared to date. The Greens and the Animal Justice Party gave their full support for those 60 policy recommendations from the specialists in the field. The Liberal National Coalition and Labour indicated partial support for the policies to end sexual, domestic and family violence. And the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party showed strong support across the recommendations. And this builds on the work we did at the Candidate Forum in Western Sydney. So yeah, that's really, that website has some really key documents and some images and things you can throw on your social media. And we've got 5 days left to really try and push our government to be accountable. And we know the hard work starts from the 25th of March, whoever is in power. There is a lot of work to do. We've not been overly impressed with some of the funding aligned to this very, very significant issue affecting, so many women and children across the state and Australia. So moving on to a couple of other key updates, Domestic Violence New South Wales has been strongly advocating to maintain the ERO funding, the equal remuneration funding for homelessness services. And interestingly, on the tracks, I'm finding some people know about this and some people don't, but it impacts homelessness services in New South Wales by 8.7 million. Federal government would top up this money to the state government, and federal government are saying they're not going to be able to do that at the moment, which causes us deep concern. The top up of this funding, this 8.7 million across homelessness services, provides critical support to people who have lost or are at risk of losing their home. We know at the moment, with record rent increases over the past couple of years and record low vacancy rates, meaning that homelessness services are even under much more immense pressure. So we really need to see this ERO funding topped up. And we've also been calling on DCJ, the Department of Communities and Justice, to check that they're advocating on behalf of our members and the state as well. And we've been reassured that they have been writing to the federal government to maintain this funding. Also, in regard to housing advocacy, we wrote to Minister Ward and Minister McLaren-Jones to address our serious concerns on housing and homelessness issues affecting women, children and older people across the state. We're concerned that 40 recommendations made by the Standing Committee on Social Issues report in homelessness amongst older people. So 40 recommendations were made, and that was again for older people aged over 55. And the government supported just 9 of those 40 recommendations. So we have written to Minister Ward and Minister McLaren-Jones, sharing our real fear around lack of action and accountability regarding Australia's fastest growing homelessness population. If you're just entering, if you could pop yourself on mute, that would be great. So those are just a couple of things happening at the moment. There's actually so much advocacy going on. I'm just basically hoping people are reading our weekly newsletter, and we hope we're not overwhelming you with information, but we're doing a huge amount of work to try and keep that level of action and accountability going. And just from those 2 examples, you can see there's a lot that needs to be done, whoever gets in power from the 25th of March. So some upcoming events to share. Lisa's going to throw some things in the chat box. We've got on the 11th and 12th of May, Domestic Violence New South Wales and the New South Wales collaboration on the prevention of gender-based violence will be holding a primary prevention forum for practitioners. And that's on the 11th and 12th of May, and City of Sydney are going to be supporting us with that event, so more details coming. We've also partnered with People with Disability Australia to run disability awareness training in Sydney on the 4th of April. There are limited spaces available for this session, but there will also be an online version of training on the 16th of May. And again, we'll be throwing that information in the chat box. And just to let you also know that we're hosting a free webinar for businesses next week to make sure the businesses are really thinking about that domestic and family violence leave coming and think about practical ways to support workplaces. So I'll be speaking about the impact of domestic violence in the workplace. We have Business Australia speaking about the recent domestic and family violence workplace report they did with us. We've got Commonwealth Bank Ryan Burke speaking about the work they've been doing. And of course, we'll be sharing the resources from Insight Exchange, which are survivor-led practical tools and resources that can be implemented in the workplace. Again, details will go into the chat box. Amazingly, I did that in 6 minutes, which is really good. So now moving on to our fabulous speakers. What I'm going to do is introduce Jan first and then move to Karina. So first up, you will hear from Jan Primrose about the paid domestic and family violence leave entitlements. Jan is a huge ally of our organisation. She is the Assistant State Secretary at the Australian Services Union New South Wales and ACT Services Branch, where she's worked in the Professional Standards and Safety Unit and the Australian College of Community and Disability Practitioners. Jan has a professional background in the sector, having worked in family and domestic violence and sexual violence, mental health and women's health for a long time. She has a long history in the union movement and is a political activist, working closely with other activists across the women's movement, students, First Nations people, climate activists, LGBTIQ plus communities and others to achieve genuine, and I really hear you there, Jan, it's very meaningful the work you do and we really support it, so genuine equity and equality. She continues to work with these groups in a community alliance against recent anti-protest legislation in New South Wales, and that's been really important work. While at the ASU, Jan has worked with ASU members and other unions in a successful national campaign to win a universal right to 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave. She's currently working with the members across the community and disability services sectors towards workplace legislation and funding reform to support equal pay and conditions for workers, regardless of who they are and how they're employed. So Jan's going to speak to us today about paid domestic and family violence leave, and then we will have a Q&A session. So welcome, Jan, and thank you for joining our sector chat today. Thank you.
Look, thanks, Delia. It's a great honour for me to be here joining you today. Before I start, I wanted to pay my respects to First Nations people, their elders past and present. And I wanted to also say that the ASU Branch Council has voted unanimously to support the referendum for the voice, and we're working very hard with our members in an effort to support the voice, not only in workplaces but also in our personal lives. I also wanted to particularly acknowledge the work that Delia and DV New South Wales has been doing in relation to sector funding. Without the work that Delia and DV New South Wales has been leading, amongst other peaks, that work would be significantly diminished. The ASU is working with Homelessness Australia and Homelessness New South Wales, along with Delia at DV New South Wales and Y Foundation, in what I think is a very effective and powerful alliance to undo the very poor decisions in relation to funding for the sector. And I do want to acknowledge the work that any other organisation who's with us today has been doing to support that work, because like everything, as Anthony Albanese said, the Prime Minister, when he introduced paid family and domestic violence leave, this is the successful result of a ground-up community-based campaign, and that, in my view, is what makes any campaign worthwhile. So thank you, Delia, and everyone at DV New South Wales and in the Women's Alliance, and certainly to all of you for that work. What I wanted to talk about today is another very successful ground-up community-based campaign, and that's the campaign for paid family and domestic violence leave. Once again, I wanted to acknowledge the work that has been done at DV New South Wales. Delia was a part of that campaign, and before that, Renata and her colleagues at DV New South Wales played a crucial role in the campaign as a peak organisation. But also I can see many other people who have worked and when I say tirelessly, I do mean tirelessly, for decades. I lie and tell people I'm 25. I'm clearly not. My colleague, Helen Westwood, who is here with me today, and I have been working in the women's sector long enough to remember that when someone was living with violence, it meant you threw them in the car at midnight and tried to hide them in your garage if they didn't have a mother or a sister or somewhere else that they could hide. And we've certainly moved since those very difficult days. Things are certainly not perfect now, and paid family and domestic violence leave, we have never pretended will solve the problem of family domestic violence, but it certainly makes a difference to many of the working people who we know are unable to do those critical things that need to be done when they are living with violence, or when they are planning to leave violence, or indeed when they have left violence, because we know that violence doesn't stop at the kitchen gate or kitchen door, and it also doesn't finish the day that you leave a violent relationship. So Helen is going to help me to share a PowerPoint, and I'll very quickly work through what paid family and domestic violence is. As I say, this was a great achievement of a ground-up movement that started with the Australian Services Union in Victoria. The campaign has gone on for over 10 years and was successful finally with the election of the Albanese Federal Labor government. In fact, it was the first piece of legislation that they introduced. And what you will see in this legislation very much bears the hallmarks of that union involvement, I think. So I'm going to attempt to share now, and when things go wrong, Helen will fix things for me, as she has done over the last 40 years. So the first thing we're going to do is slideshow. Okay, here we go. Terrific. All right, so this year saw the introduction of paid family and domestic violence leave. And as I've said, this was the very first piece of legislation introduced by the Federal Labor government. So what is paid family domestic violence leave? Unlike what we had before, paid family and domestic violence leave is a legislated entitlement for over 11 million working people in Australia. And unlike what we had before, it is a paid entitlement. So not 5 days unpaid leave, but it is 10 days leave entitlement. The leave renews every year on your anniversary, so it doesn't accrue over years, but it is available to you on the first day of your employment in any role, in any new job that you start. It's available to full-time, part-time, and for the first time in Australian history, this is an entitlement that is available to casual employees. It won't be prorated for part-time or casual employees, so they still have 10 days leave entitlement. The full 10 days leave entitlement will be available upfront. So as I've said, day one that you commence your employment, you are eligible for 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave. Because if Rosie Batty knew anything, it was that it doesn't matter how nice your house is, it doesn't matter what your postcode is, anyone in Australia can be a person living with violence. And as I said, it won't accumulate from year to year, but you do have 10 days entitlement from the first day you start work, and that leave entitlement remains with you until it is used during that year. If you don't use it, you start 10 days entitlement again the following year. The leave entitlement commenced on the 1st of February this year for all businesses except small businesses. Now, of course, many employers in the community and disability services sector are indeed what we would call small businesses. They have 15 or fewer employees. And for those people, the entitlement, which is exactly the same as what I've just set out, will commence on the 1st of August. The significant thing about paid family and domestic violence leave is that it can be used for a range of responsibilities. So that could be making arrangements for your own safety or the safety of a close relative, including, children, obviously. It could be used for attending court or going to the police. It could also be used for attending counselling or going to your doctor, financial or other legal professionals. And it can also be used for going to counselling services. And I think I repeat that because this is an entitlement that is not only available to those people with whom we work, but it's also available to the people with whom we work. Paid family and domestic violence leave will be available, as I said, to full-time, part-time and casual employees. Now, if you are a full-time employee, you are eligible, who is working 38 hours a week, you can take 10 days leave within a 38 on the base of a 38-hour week. So that means you can take 10 whole working days. If you are working part-time, say you're working 2 or 3 days a week, you still get 10 days leave per year. That is pro rata on the basis that you are working 2 days a week. So you would take, if you are working Monday and Tuesday during the week, then you can take Monday and Tuesday as paid family domestic violence this week, next week, the following week, or whatever weeks you need them. If you are a casual employee, then the days that are available to you are the days that you would have been rostered on had you been attending work. So if you work as a casual employee and you've accepted a roster that you will be working every Monday for the next 6 months, then you are able to take 10 Mondays off or part of that Monday off if you need it to do any of the things we talked about, which is attending counselling, going to the police, going to court, or so forth. And the other thing that's really significant about this, and again, for the first time, is whether you are full-time, part-time or casual, the days that you take off are not paid at the base rate. And I'll talk to you about this, I suspect, later in Q&A, but unlike paid parental leave, you are not paid at the base rate. You are paid at your full rate of pay, and that includes any overtime or other loading or penalty rate that you would have been paid for the shift that you were rostered on for. So if you're a full-time worker who generally works night shift or afternoon shift, if you're a part-time worker who works on weekends, or if you're a casual employee who works in evenings or over the weekend, it is that rate that you will be paid. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. The reason that you are paid at the rate that you would have been paid had you been working, and I feel a bit embarrassed telling you as professional family violence workers, but we all know that many perpetrators of violence in fact control the bank accounts and check the pay slips for their partners or the person against whom they are perpetrating violence. And if it becomes clear on a pay slip or in a bank account that there's something changed in your pay, then that can either lead to an escalation of violence or can interfere with any safety plans that are in place. And so one of the things that the ASU was absolutely adamant about when we were negotiating around the introduction of paid family and domestic violence leave was that it must be to all intents and purposes that nothing has changed for the person who is accessing this leave. Now, how do you apply for the leave? If an employee wants to access unpaid family and domestic violence leave, they can let their employer know. If they want to access paid family and domestic violence leave, what they should do is the same with any other leave. They should let their employer know as soon as they know that they're going to take that leave. But we all know that that doesn't always happen in an orderly fashion. And so it may well be the case that they won't know that they're going to take access this leave until after the event. And in those instances, obviously, as soon as a person is able to safely let their employer know, they should do that and let them know how long they expect to be on leave if they know that. The issue of evidence has always been a very controversial issue when I have been doing meetings in workplaces or with employers around evidence. And I can be tempted to tell you a horror story in a moment, but the issue of evidence is, and again, this was something that the ASU was really adamant about when this legislation was being introduced, that an employer may ask for evidence, and that evidence needs to be sufficient to convince a reasonable person that an employee took leave to deal with family and domestic violence leave. Now, can I repeat that? An employer may ask for evidence. They don't have to ask for evidence. But if they do, it is not evidence of a person living with violence. It is evidence that a reasonable person would need to show that you took leave to attend to a matter related to family violence. Now, that could be a letter from a counsellor. It could be a letter from a faith leader. It could be a letter from a police officer, or it could be something from a doctor or a court or a lawyer. But it certainly does not need to be evidence that a person is living with violence, and it does not need to be an obstacle to a person taking that leave. Reasonable evidence includes a stat dec or documents from the police, a court, family violence support services, and as I say, not evidence of violence, only evidence of why you need to take the leave. Employers must then take reasonable steps to keep any information about the employee's situation confidential. This was a huge issue and delayed the introduction of the legislation as members of Parliament sought in earnest, and I must say this was consistent across the spectrum, to make sure that the person living with violence has their confidentiality protected, so that it is not an issue that's discussed in the workplace, but equally so that what they are doing does not become apparent to the perpetrator. Now, if evidence around a person taking paid family domestic violence leave can only be disclosed to the extent that that's required by law or is necessary to protect the life, health and safety either of the employee or of another person. Now, pay slips is something that I mentioned before. Pay slips need to record family domestic violence leave not as leave, but as something that's being done in the normal course of the employee's work. Pay slips cannot, in fact, mention that paid family and domestic violence leave has been accessed. Employers need to keep a record of leave balances and any leave taken by employees confidential. And those records need to be private and cannot be accessed by anyone apart from the employee. Interaction with other leave, it's really important to note that an employee is not required to reduce or use all of their other leave prior to using and accessing paid family domestic violence leave. And finally, and I again feel slightly embarrassed telling you this, but of course we always say to people, if any of the discussion that we've had today causes you or anyone that you're associated with any concern, there are some really good family support services, and all of you would be included in those services. So I guess now, Delia, it is only for me to end the slideshow and end the presentation, and then ask people if you have any questions, or perhaps you want to go to your next speaker and we're going to do joint questions. I'm not sure what works for you best.
Hi, Jan. I think we'll keep with the questions now, and then I'll introduce our next speaker. Did anyone have questions, members? Are there things that you wanted to ask? I think there's a lot of information that's come up there. I'm sure there might be some offline questions, Jan, but did anyone want to pop their hand up and ask a question or throw something in the chat box? Great, we've got a hand up from Kate. Would you like to ask your question?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Not sure why my screen's gone blank, but it has. I just wanted to say, not so much a question, but fantastic work. It's really helpful to have just some very clear information about where it's up to, and knowing the number of women that we support, being able to help them navigate that process. This will be really helpful. So thanks to everyone who's worked on it, and well done.
Thanks, Kate. And I know you're one of the people that helped, so thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Kate. Anybody else for some questions? I might throw one in then. Do we know, Jan, the effort that's going to be made noting that small businesses have to be prepared by August? I know that certainly from some of the work we've been doing with Business Australia, there's real anxiety for small businesses, and I'm sure that's why everyone wants to make sure we're doing really good training and getting, you know, these businesses ready to look at culture and practice and policy. Do you know of any kind of initiatives or effort that the Australian government will be making to get those organisations ready, or it's a case if you've got this time, you know, you've basically got till August, you've got to be ready by then?
Sure. Look, Delia, that's a really good question. I think there have been some businesses who have been really genuinely frightened of the new legislation, and that's also been managers and boards in our sector as well, and have said, how are we going to pay for this? How's it going to work? You know, what's going to happen if everyone at my place takes 10 days off? It'll cost me a fortune. The organisation will collapse. I get that, because there was a lot of scaremongering, particularly by the previous government at a federal level. I have to say, and I'm quite open about it, I think that is shameful what the last government did. There is no need to be frightened of this at all. In fact, we know that a large number of corporations and small businesses, and in fact organisations in our sector, have had paid family domestic violence leave policies, either in their enterprise agreement or just as HR policies in their workplaces, in some cases for years, and those organisations are still alive and kicking. And they range from very small organisations with only 5 or 6 employees up to Qantas. So we're talking about the full gamut of organisations. None of them have fallen over. No. The evidence both in Australia and overseas is that on average, the maximum amount of time that an employee will take off is less than 2 days per year. The second thing is that on evidence both in Australia and overseas, both in our sector and in the corporate sector, in small businesses and in large businesses, and as I say, in the community services sector, is that, and I'm sure all of you would be aware of this, is that the cost of recruiting a new employee, training them and getting them up to speed to replace an employee who chooses to leave or is forced to leave their job because they can't cope with the imposts of living with violence and work. On average, it's currently taking 16 weeks to recruit, employ and train a new employee, whereas we're talking about 2 days per year, and that's for those people who access paid family and domestic violence leave, and that is leaving aside all of the ethical, moral and other considerations that people would have about knowing that an employee is living with family and domestic violence. I might also say that family and domestic violence can very quickly become a very live workplace.
Just gone on mute there, Jan. We might get you to just repeat the last 10 seconds if you don't mind. Thank you.
We know that many perpetrators of family violence, in fact, visit a workplace and can cause problems not only for the person against whom they're perpetrating violence, but against other colleagues in that workplace. And so an effective way of an employer or manager dealing with workplace health and safety is to provide paid family and domestic violence leave so that a person can deal with those issues. We know that it's an ethical way of dealing with a person who is their employee living with violence. We know also that it can be a very effective way of helping that person plan to access resources so that they can either deal with a violent relationship or leave a violent relationship. And we also know that for many people who are living with violence, often the only safe place for them is when they are at work. So providing paid family and domestic violence will not solve family domestic violence leave, but it will save lives. We have no doubt about that at all. And it does address, as I say, not only those workplace health and safety issues, not only the practical concerns for a person living with violence, it's an ethical response by an employer that makes them an employer of choice. But we also know, answering that question about how is it going to be paid for, that is in fact an investment. It is cheaper to give someone 2 days off when they need it or whatever they need and retain a loyal, safe employee than it is to watch that person either leave by choice or feel forced to leave and then have to recruit and retain a new employee. So there's no downside to paid family and domestic violence leave.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Jan, because I think people misunderstand that bit, that actually culture, health and retention are on the up because of those very important initiatives. So
Absolutely.
Rachel's thrown a question in the chat box, so I'll just read it out. And it says, a recent client let her employer know she needed DV leave. She works on a casual on-call basis. He told her that she had not worked on the roster or on for the next couple of weeks, despite previously having plenty of work. So I'm assuming that maybe he removed some of her shifts. What are her rights? Who do we contact? Rachel, did you want to add to that? Were you okay with how I framed that?
Delia and Rachel, maybe I can begin by saying that, of course, I'm hoping that Rachel's client is a union member. And I don't say that sarcastically at all. I say that because this is now an industrial right for more than 11 million workers in Australia. And so your first port of call, if you have an industrial problem, should always be your union delegate or union organiser. So if Rachel's client is a union member, then absolutely Rachel's client should contact their union. If Rachel's client is not a union member, then as I said, this is an industrial right, and Rachel's member can contact the Fair Work Ombudsman for free, either online or by telephone, for confidential advice and support, and can also contact the Fair Work Commission for confidential advice and a discussion about what their rights might be. And I can also say that if Rachel's client had already accepted those shifts that were rostered, then absolutely Rachel's client has a right to access paid family domestic violence leave. You do not have to have worked any shifts at all. As I said, this is an entitlement that is available to all workers on day one of employment. This is the Rosie Batty clause, I reckon.
That's great, thank you. And you mentioned the Fair Work Ombudsman, and was there another link you mentioned, Jan, that we could just throw in the chat box?
Yeah, so the Fair Work Ombudsman and the Fair Work Commission, I would suggest first of all that people would go to the Fair Work Ombudsman's site. They have some updated information which is very good and very clear in relation to paid family and domestic violence leave, and that's a PDF that can be downloaded and provide you with advice, but there's also a contact number that you could ring. Can I also say that for those of you who work in the sector, the government has advised that there will be a review of the legislation in 12 months. So if you could keep just some dot point notes of any issues that you're finding, really important to give Helen or me a ring at the ASU and tell us any problems you're having. We'll be putting in submissions to that review, or you can certainly do that yourself. The other thing is that the federal government is working very closely with Business Peaks, Delia, to provide loads of information and support to small businesses about the implementation of this new entitlement. So there is, and those Business Peaks, we hope, are providing that information in turn to all of their members. So there should be no excuse at all for any small or large business to claim that they didn't understand. But can I just say, not all employers in big or small businesses are bad, not by a million light years. We've had enormous support from business right across the spectrum. And you know what? This is a new entitlement. Everyone's going to make mistakes. Good employees are going to make mistakes. Workers are going to make mistakes. Unions are going to make mistakes. DV workers, with all due respect, are going to make mistakes. And the idea is, if you make a mistake, you go, whoops, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. So you know, all of us are going to make ourselves as aware as we can be of the information. And you know what? I make 500 mistakes on a good day, So if we acknowledge that there's been a mistake and then rectify the mistake and move on. But for that very, very small group of people who really don't care, and that would be no one we know, I hope, as I say, if workers in the sector could just keep some notes of what's gone wrong, either deliberately or an error in drafting of the legislation, because there are going to be errors, as careful as we have been, and let us know, because we want to get all the kinks out of this. We've been working for this collectively for a very long time. It's not perfect yet, but we want to work towards it becoming perfect. And you are absolutely the best people in the world to help us to get there.
Awesome, Jan. Thank you so much. And I think that I was going to echo that point which you just did, which is great for people to take notes as this does move forward. And Jan has put her email and contact details in the chat box. We thank you so much, Jan. That was really, really helpful. And I think there'll be ongoing conversation with you and maybe another invitation back to discuss this further, but we'll see how much we can push our luck with you. Thank you, Jan.
Great honour. Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Delia.
Great stuff. Thanks, Jan. So moving on to our second awesome speaker, Karina Noble. So Karina is a disabled queer person who is a passionate advocate for incorporating lived experience in working towards better outcomes for women and gender diverse people with disability. They are currently managing the Building Access project at People with Disability Australia, which is an initiative enabling domestic and family violence services to better meet the needs of women and children with disability. Karina has an extensive background in the not-for-profits advocacy for long-term social change and the disability sector. They are also a Pilates instructor and love encouraging people to enjoy moving their bodies. So I don't know if that's Karina encouraging us to kind of shake around and get involved and stand up as she does her wonderful update to us. And they do their wonderful update. And I'm really, really, really pleased to see you, Karina. It's been great hearing about your work. The last few weeks, we've just had a couple of good engagements where you've been able to update us about those projects. And I welcome you to the DVNSW sector chat floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Delia. And thanks so much, Jan, as well, for sharing that. I learned a lot, and particularly ways to communicate some of the difficulties around that new leave to people who are struggling to understand the implications of it. So thank you. So I am here representing People with Disabilities Australia today. We have been working over the last almost 6 years now on a project called the Building Access Project. And this project is basically aims to increase accessibility to family and domestic violence services for women and gender diverse folk with disability, and also their children with disability as well. So I am just going to quickly share my screen here. Comes up. Okay, so the project itself is coming to an end. We're in phase 2 of the project. The first 4 years, we did a series of audits with service providers in the domestic and family violence sector. And that ranged from crisis accommodation to legal services, counselling services, right across the board. And from those audits, the services implemented some recommended changes to their physical accessibility for buildings, also their resources, websites, and some of them are still continuing to implement them as we go. We helped people create disability inclusion action plans. Oh, it couldn't start the content. Is that right? Is it displaying?
You've got to love Teams. We've just lost the share screen. I don't know if you can try again, Karina.
That's
Thank
okay.
you.
Yeah, no problem. That's no problem. It's all right if it doesn't work. And so basically changing the physical accessibility and resources, but also attitudinal accessibility. So one of the stats we came across was 74% of workers in the sector were not confident that they were able to provide appropriate support to a woman with disability coming to access their service. And so that's significant. 74% of people didn't feel confident engaging with people with disability, and those rates were very, very high, even higher for engaging with people with intellectual disability. So out of that first phase of work, we developed a series of resources. I'm going to pop in the chat our website as I talk. And on the website is all of the links to our resources that are listed here on the slide as well. And you can download them as PDFs. They're all accessible PDFs. Something that was really significant, the resource created with Wild in Queensland, was a handbook on supporting people with intellectual disability. And it's actually an amazing and significant resource. It is a large resource, but alongside that sits a video explaining the resource, but also kind of summarising, you know, how to best support people with intellectual or cognitive disabilities. So I really recommend having a look at some of these resources. There's also easy read resources that you can use with clients around abuse, sexual abuse, how to report, dealing with police, all those kind of things. And they're really fantastic. And I really love easy read resources. I really recommend that as service providers that you and your colleagues are familiar with them, familiar with using them, and actually and you can also use them with people who don't have intellectual disability. You know, they're actually fantastic, simplified ways to really explain difficult concepts sometimes. And sometimes I think we try and over-explain things. And so the more familiar you are with a resource, when you actually need to use it and support someone who really needs that resource, you'll already be across it and be kind of familiar with it. It's really hard to use resources when you have to go digging, go, oh, I know that exists, but yeah, so if you can familiarise yourself with Easy Read, I highly recommend it. And most of you will be familiar with the Sunny app, so they sit really well alongside the Sunny app. And also for your workplaces on that website is some resources around creating disability inclusion action plans. How are you going to make your workplace more inclusive for your staff, for the attitudes and culture, and also for your clients, of course. Representation matters, so making your workplace accessible, not just for your clients, but for encouraging women and gender diverse folk with disability to work in your workplace, you know, is really useful because one of the things most of you probably know, these stats around women with disability is that they experience domestic and family violence at 40% higher rates than our general community. And that goes up to 90% of people with intellectual disabilities. So we know that in my community, it's a significant amount of people, and anecdotally, it's probably more in my circles. It's actually huge. And so making sure that we have that representation in our workplaces is actually really important. And there's a really cool PDF there, 30 ways to make your service more accessible. And some of those are really like simple ways that you can increase accessibility without outlaying much money. It takes a little bit of time. Some of the things we recommend is putting, like, on a monthly meeting, just a little bit on your agenda on how to increase inclusivity in general, and then you can pop disability in there, and also other looking at other ways to increase, like, your inclusion in the workplace across a whole heap of marginalizations. So I really recommend you have a look at those resources. And if you have any questions about them, please let me know, and I will provide them in any way that we can to help you. So to wind up the project, we are in a phase now where we're trying to collate all of the data and provide recommendations and findings report to Women New South Wales, who funded it, part of DCJ, and so that going forward, there are tangible plans. There is a framework being developed by DCJ, which most of you are probably aware of, a 10-year plan, and making sure that there's adequate funding provided for services to increase accessibility. So we know that once services engage with an audit and we make recommendations to increase accessibility, people want to do it. You all want to increase the accessibility, but obviously money. So we've got finances and human resources, significant, like, barrier there to doing those things, particularly retrofitting old buildings. It's difficult. So there is funding that's sort of being talked about, you know, in terms of actually for service providers to directly apply for funding to increase accessibility. It's coming. We want to make sure that we have covered everything that's necessary, and we have the voices of everyone working in this sector, you, the service providers, in our surveys, and understanding that, like, what your needs are now to date. And also we have currently conducting one-on-one interviews with women and gender diverse folk who are experiencing violence or have experienced violence in the past. And their experiences with accessing services. We understand there are significant barriers for people, which include not accessing at all because the barriers are so significant they aren't even reaching your services. So we are working really hard to understand this in its entirety here in New South Wales. And also KPMG is doing it on a national level. So this project is actually being rolled out nationally by KPMG for the Department of Social Services. So how can you help? We have an online survey for service providers. It takes less than 10 minutes to complete, and we'd really love to ask for your help to complete the survey. Multiple people from an organisation can complete it because we know that people work in different parts of organisations and have different understandings and are working, you know, sometimes on the face-to-face with clients, sometimes not. So we encourage anyone who is willing to fill it out to please do. And also, if you're an advocacy agency as well, it's also appropriate for you to complete the survey. I am going to pop the link in the chat to the survey and also the QR code there. You can scan that with your phone. It has also been in all of the communications that were sent out by DV New South Wales. Thank you to Sarah and Delia for that, and also to Shelley as well. So if you're part of the Women's Alliance mailings, you may have actually received it from some of your advocacy agencies in your local area. So if you could please take the time, if you're able, to fill that out. If you require it in a different format, please let me know and I can provide that to you in a more accessible format. Otherwise, it's online on SurveyMonkey. And the more engagement we get, the better we can, you know, make sure that everything's covered in our findings and recommendations report, which has actually been sought not just by the funder, DCJ. I have been speaking to multiple departments with the New South Wales government and also the federal government, including NDIA and NDIS. So there is a lot of people in the government that in different governments, other states, South Australia as well, that are after this information. They want to know. They're trying to form their plans at the moment for the next however many years. They're all different for each area, but they're wanting this information. So please, if you can take the time, it would be very much appreciated. And thank you to everyone who has already completed the survey. Thanks very much to DV New South Wales. You have significantly helped our engagement with the survey, so thank you. And that's me, if anyone has any questions.
I was going to ask, I'll jump in with one again, and then I'm sure everyone will go with it. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping in front of Kate, I'm going to let Kate go first. Thank you, Kate, go for it.
Sorry, we've got a bit of a pattern here, don't we? I just wanted to, I guess, comment. It's fantastic to hear about your work. I wasn't aware of it. One of the programs that we run is a women's refuge in Darlinghurst in the inner city in New South Wales. And we are in a horrendous property in terms of access, and it's a real issue for us and our board. Literally 6 flights of steps with every bedroom upstairs. And we have been part of that review based on the Ombudsman's report as the department go through and do the audit to have a look at access issues in their properties. We're a heritage listed property. So any fantasy of lifts and otherwise, I'm sure there's a lot of services in the same position, are unrealistic. And I'm a bit of the view that we need to push back harder on the department in terms of it not being good enough, rather than just accepting the property that we've had for 40 years because it's a property and we should be grateful for it. I'm curious to kind of, I guess, Karina, know a bit more. I mean, it's been great to hear, and I should probably pick your brains offline. But is there a movement towards that? What are you finding? Do you think there'll be any appetite from the department? We're realistic. We don't think the department is suddenly going to come up with a purpose-built refuge in the inner city. I know that the core and cluster funding is looking at that, but we're not completely in that criteria. We take women other than women fleeing DV. So I guess I'm curious, my ears pricked up when you said KPMG and the work that they're doing. Has there been much pushback from services around it not being good enough? And is there any kind of advocacy or action that's happening?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Yeah, there's a lot in there, and yes and no. There is pushback, but also, as I'm sure you're aware, everyone is overworked and there is not a lot of time to devote to that kind of, advocacy work back to funders. You're not alone in the sense that the physical accessibility of your building is a problem. We know that, like you said, you have to be grateful for what you got, kind of thing. And it is, of course, so that is actually significant in the physical accessibility of buildings, because they are often, buildings that no one else wanted to use, because they're cheap, they're in flood zones, there's stairs, there's a whole heap of other accessibility, but also other issues going on with the buildings, and that's why they have been provided in that sense. It isn't good enough, no. And there are some really some cool things being done with people who are starting up second sites particularly for crisis accommodation. And they are being planning, because they worked with us with their existing sites. They're trying to plan to do it better for new sites. Of course, this is dependent on funding, but if you are looking at doing new sites or moving buildings or whatever it might be, retrofitting something with 6 flights of stairs for wheelchair access is not likely to happen in a heritage building. However, it is possible to to get funding to do other things. So it might not be physically accessible for some people, but you can make it sensory accessible. You can make everything accessible for people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities. There's a bunch of other things that you can do accessibility wise that makes it a safe place for as many people with disability as is possible with what you're working with. No one expects this to be perfect. It's not like we walk in and go, right, here's $1.5 million for a facility and you're going to be Silver Star accessible, you know, in 3 months. Like, that's not realistic. And so it's working with an accessibility audit to do the things that you can do, you know, working within what you have, and then for any future plans, if you are working with pushback and trying to change buildings, etc., then working with an accessibility consultant to make sure that plans are in place to do better the next time. So the resources are based around both of those things, you know, working with what you have and trying to increase accessibility as much as possible. And also, yeah, planning for any future sites or future resources, you know, retrofitting rooms for sensory disability, for children with sensory disabilities, you know, all of those things that make a service to be better able to provide support and ongoing care for people. Because for those of you that have worked with women with disability, particularly with kids with disability, we know that people come to services, and if they're not able to, like if the service can't meet their needs or their kids' needs, it's very distressing, particularly if someone comes to a service and their kids' disability needs aren't being met. It's distressing for the kids and distressing for the parent, and to meet those children's needs, they end up going back to the place where violence was being perpetrated, and that's obviously very distressing for everyone involved. So there's many things that can be done that, like, if we start to think about, like, think outside the box of, you know, this gold star standard physically accessible toilets, like, there's a lot more that can be done for accessibility.
And Karina, I think on that, I think the Core and Cluster needs to think more about that as well. And I think, and as we're wrapping up, I'm so sorry because it's 4:01. I think people might be dropping off, but I think I'd want to continue the conversation with you as well. I think there's a lot more. We could have done 2 separate sector chats with the issues that have come up today. And I think, Karina, if you're okay with it, we'd love to be able to share your contact details for members, because I think there's a lot that we need to be thinking about. And I think it's a fail to plan to fail if we aren't using these resources. I know we're time poor, but there's a huge amount of information that Karina's provided today, and we really encourage our members to get amongst it. Reach out to ourselves or Karina if you want to talk further about that. And I think even for DVNSW, we need to be doing some targeted advocacy beyond the products you provided and making sure it's front and centre in decision making. And I'm also very intrigued to hear more about funding coming, but I'm sure you'll update us about that in due course, Karina.
Yeah, we're still obviously in conversation, but this is one of the reasons. So we've been told by the funder in our finding and recommendations report to put a proposal forward for everything that we need from the findings. So the more of you that fill out the survey, the more information we have, the more data and like we have, because we have quantitative and qualitative data coming from those surveys that we can give the funder and be like, this is what we need, because it's been 6 years and it needs to continue. There's been so much fantastic work done with the project that we don't want it to end, even if it changes form and it's not the same project, but it's still going to the sector. There's so much that needs to be done. And yeah, so yeah,
well, we'll keep throwing that survey out. It was in our weekly digest last week. I'll put it in again this week. We've got that in the chat box. And again, thank you so much, and incredible work, Jan and Karina. That's the end of our sector chat, everyone. Go well, and we'll be continuing these conversations as we're going to need to.